at the age of 77, I often feel that I'm still an emerging scholar, there's still a lot to learn. And as Evelyn Blumenberg said, after 20 or 30 years in your career, there's still more to learn than to teach. I taught my first graduate class in transportation at Northwestern University in 1967, 52 years ago. And I'll be teaching a class next quarter at UCLA on pretty much the same topic, though hopefully with a little bit of renewed material. In retrospect, I certainly think about my academic career as having been enormously satisfying. I could not imagine having had as much fun as I've actually had when I first began. I had no idea it was going to be so rewarding. In every aspect of it, being at the university, being active in the Transportation Research Board, and eventually being the chairman of the Transportation Research Board, all of those things have been rewarding and satisfying and inspirational. I thought about the topic that was the title of today's event. The word emerging scholars was used, and I paused and thought about it for a bit, and I realized, of course, that the word scholar is not the same as the word researcher. This is not a symposium. It is about transportation research, but the title is scholars. Today, the words scholarship and research are often used by young scholars interchangeably. They are not synonyms. And I'd like to tell you that in my career, they have not been synonyms. I've certainly done research and enjoyed it and taught as well and enjoyed that. But scholarship is more than research. Research, to me, includes the collection of data, the use of analytical methods, tests, simulations of the sort that we've been hearing this morning, and reaching conclusions about the likely consequences of different potential technologies or different potential policies. And universities today especially expect that young scholars will do research and do research and do research and publish and publish and publish their results. But transportation scholars today are probably more skilled and sophisticated when it comes to analysis and simulation and statistical methods than I was when I entered the field, certainly because the methods are so far advanced. We collected and analyzed a lot of data, but you have access to a world of data that we didn't have. We spent much more time getting much less information than you can in a few minutes on the internet. Advancement, especially in universities, is today, I acknowledge, more dependent on published original research, and today's methodological sophistication and today's data availability are all increasingly complex and sophisticated than ever before, and demand more and more of your time. But there are other aspects of scholarship that I thought I should mention as being important and that you should consider at the beginning of your career. When I started my career, what we call scholarship also included a great deal of writing that was philosophical, political, analytical in an interpretive way, based on thoughts that had been expressed for thousands of years, and not necessarily on data that was drawn from the real world at that time. So, for example, planning theory, which those of you who are PhD students in urban planning will have to study or have already studied, was a serious business. It was about how planning should be done in the world, but not based on data, based on moral philosophy and based on the analysis of how organizations work and how decisions are made in a complex political environment. It was based on principles as well as observations. And today, there's a great emphasis on empiricism and quantification and analysis, and that tends to crowd out the philosophical, moral, ethical, and behavioral analysis about the way decisions can and policies should be made in the world. One after another, doctoral students tell me that their dissertation research will have to be quantitative and analytical in order that they can get a job, because that's what universities look for. And therefore, they take the necessary courses in philosophy and theory and ethics and so on, but they don't devote that to their scholarly emergence, as an emerging scholar. It's mostly about research. And that may be practical in the immediate future, but few who start that way ever turn later in their careers to reflection and analysis of scholarship that is not empirical and research-based, that may be more philosophical. Socialized by an empirical world in which we do our research, we rarely become theorists late in our careers. And I would quickly note that Lisa Schweitzer, who is about to moderate the next session, is one person who has done that. She has stepped back from her empirical, technical transportation research and has embraced some of these more theoretical notions later in her career. But that's only one aspect of what I wanted to talk about, and I only mentioned it briefly. More importantly, and I'll devote more time to this, is that as significant to me as I recall my 5 decades of scholarly work, is the role of professional practice, engagement in the delivery of service to organizations, governments, consulting firms, private clients. When I was a student, many of my teachers were people who came to the university after decades of working in the field. And that was important to my education. They talked about real projects and what they had learned from them. They offered insights from practice that helped me understand what our empirical analysis meant when it was transplanted from the academia into the real world of practice, which is much more complex. After it's been worked over by politicians, business people, newspapers, and public opinion, what does your research say? Something quite different than it says after you finish doing the simulation or running the statistical model. And that is really important. And I would also like to argue that it's fun and interesting and stimulating, and it makes you a better teacher and a better researcher. So that's enormously important in the fields of transportation, whether it's engineering or planning or public policy that is your major. Get involved in the world as well as in your laboratory or in your statistical analysis. I personally, I can speak from the satisfaction of a long and complex career. Looking back over it, there isn't a minute that wasn't fun. But I always wanted to be engaged in the practice of my profession as well as in research and teaching. I started that as a graduate student when I joined the Rogers Park Community Council. I lived in Rogers Park, a neighborhood in North Chicago near Evanston, where Northwestern was, as the transportation chairman. And within 2 weeks, I was sitting down with Mayor Daley to talk about the transportation needs of my community, the father of the more recent Mayor Daley, Richard J. Daley. And boy, that was interesting. And it certainly was a rare thing for a graduate student to have that opportunity. As a consultant, serving on public committees and commissions, being, in my case, the transportation advisor to Mayor Richard Riordan in Los Angeles, testifying before state legislatures, 3 or 4 different states, and congressional committees, that has been essential to me as a learning experience. It's influenced my scholarly work and my teaching far more than you might imagine. Try it. You'll like it. But not for the most obvious reason that most of us initially do it. It makes you feel important. That's great. I mean, I'm going to testify before the X or Y or whatever. I must be pretty important. That's not the reason that it has been so satisfying. In fact, it's often frustrating. I got on a plane and flew to Washington just to testify for 5 minutes and was told by the chair of the committee, we're out of time. Could you just submit it in writing and leave? And, the experience itself is often not so rewarding, except for what you bring back, what you learn from the experience. When I was young, I thought that my analytical findings could be useful to policymakers and it might actually be the case that I'm smart enough to influence real world decisions. They're going to hear from me that congestion pricing is a good thing and go and do it. How naive of me to have thought so. But I learned a lot from trying. I joined boards and committees and commissions to change what they did. And of course, what happened in the process was that it changed my thinking. I have to acknowledge to you that, now that my career is near its end, that I look back and I say I probably influenced elected officials or changed public policy to a very, very, very small degree ever, if at all. I was told, and I'm still being told every month when I go to these meetings, that what I have to say is impractical, unrealistic, and in a few cases I've been told it's ridiculous. The mayor of Alhambra stood up after I finished making speaking at a meeting at which she was present, and she waved her fist in the air. Her face was red, and she said, "You're just being academic." Well, professors maybe have a right to be, but her reaction to what I had to say, based on my research and scholarly work, was that it was absurd and out of bounds. County Supervisor Zev Yaroslavsky introduced me once when I went before the Metro Board, the LA County Metropolitan Transportation Commission Board. He introduced me very kindly and very fully. And then he closed his introduction by saying, "I know what he's going to say, and he's wrong." From such experiences, we do learn about things beyond what our simulation models and our statistical models actually tell us. The real world does have concerns that differ from those that we address through traditional research. From those kinds of engagements, I learned an enormous amount. The benefits of engaging in practice and policy accrued to me far more than the organizations that I worked with, and they influenced my thought far more than I influenced their thought. Working with practitioners and policymakers, and as was mentioned, journalists, I've spent countless hours. I really want to have better newspaper reporting and television reporting about the subjects we work on. And sometimes when I watch television coverage or read a newspaper report, I realize how little the reporter who is telling people about traffic congestion or about automated vehicles actually knows, how little they know. And I try to influence them. This is a form of scholarship, and that's what I really want to bring to you, the thought I want to bring to you as, quote, emerging scholars. It takes some skill to train and influence people like that. And by practicing for 30 or 40 or 50 years, I'm still challenged. How do you do it well? How do you deliver a complex message in a short television appearance where you might be interviewed for 1 minute or a minute and a half? How do you do justice to your research in that setting? Well, learning how to do that is actually an element of scholarship. It's not to be sneered at. It's not to be overlooked. Writing papers about your scholarly work will reach an audience of, there are surveys that would show that some journal articles that are published are actually never read by anybody, but the best ones are read by a handful of people, dozens, not hundreds. But participating before the Metro Board or in a television program, you reach thousands, millions of people in some cases. And it's important to incorporate that into what you do in your scholarly work. Your scholarly work becomes more relevant if you can reach a much larger audience. But by the same token, you learn from that, from being embedded in that environment, how to modify your scholarly work. We may, as a community, because of our increased focus on research, complex data analysis, simulation, statistical analysis, we may be doing better work than ever before and reaching fewer people with it than ever before. And so I would say that as an emerging scholar, I really, really want to encourage you to get out into the world and bring back to campus what you learn there. I have used in my teaching and in my research more often what I've learned in the practice world than I have influenced the world of practice. I was a better teacher and researcher because of my engagement. But something else became clearer to me sometime during my 7th decade. I really didn't understand this. It came to me just, in the past few years, I began to realize it. I may have had little to no influence immediately on the Metro Board or Caltrans or the US DOT when I have worked with them and tried to influence them based on my research finding. But when my students ended up 20 or 30 years later working for them or working in consulting firms to those which serve those agencies, or serving as, in several cases, city managers or state of transportation officials, I gradually came to notice that they were actually putting into place some of what they had learned from me. And they actually even occasionally, come back to the university and give me credit for that, which I really appreciated. The older you get, the more you appreciate it, I should add. So, I was not right that I was not influencing policy when I went before boards and argued certain things. I was really doing it in a sort of a more indirect and circuitous way. And yet, I don't think I could have been as helpful to those students as I was had I not been out in the world talking to mayors and metro boards and so on. Because of what I learned by engaging in practice, what they took away from my classes contributed to their professional competence. And looking back from where I sit now, that seems far more important than me influencing the Metro Board with a particular policy recommendation. The truth is that as scholars, with people with doctorates, we focus on research, but our students, maybe 5% of my students have been PhD students, and 95% have gone into practice, master's students and undergraduates, and that may be even an underestimate of the proportion that have not become, quote, scholars. And it seems important, extremely important to me, that we recognize that from the beginning. And I don't know how I could have brought to my students insights that would really inform their practice if I hadn't engaged in some practice myself. It's kind of funny and maybe a little off color, but I want to say it anyway. When I gave a talk in a seminar, and I mentioned this sort of thing, and one student had missed the seminar, wasn't present, and he asked another student, "What did Wachs say?" And the answer was, "Wachs says you shouldn't be a sex therapist if you're a virgin." I didn't say that, the student did. But it's a funny way, and maybe a slightly off color way, not really, to illustrate the point. I mean, you can't theorize and teach about practice unless you have done some practice yourself. I'd like, and it's a simple message, and I hope that in your careers you will do at least a little bit of that. Everybody says the same thing. I got to work too hard on my dissertation now than to engage to join some advisory board or committee or commission. I'll do it later. Then you're an assistant professor and you say, well, I got to get these publications out. I got to get my tenure. I can't do it now, but I'll do it later. And then later, it's too late because you've already sort of established yourself in a mold of doing the same thing over and over again. And my advice as emerging scholars is to encourage you to get out into the field and do some engagement with what's happening. Join the committees of the Transportation Research Board and you'll meet people who are practitioners of the same thing that you're scholarly about. And the interaction will benefit you. Go to public hearings, go to events that relate to the public, but which address the subject matter that you're studying, and see how different the world sees what you're working on. It's shocking sometimes, it's upsetting, but it's valuable. I want to close with a true story that I hope sort of illustrates my point. In 1980, I remember the year because I was reporting on a published paper that was published in 1980. In 1980, I stood before the board of what was then called the Southern California Rapid Transit District. It later became Metro. It was the regional transit operator. And based upon my research, which I had just done with 3 graduate students, all of whom are already retired today, one of whom was named Robert Severo, who was a rather famous academic at Berkeley in the field of transportation later in his career. I advocated before the SCRTD board distance-based and time of day fares variations in public transit, coupled with congestion pricing on the roads, and argued that it was an equitable and efficient way of dealing with what was then seen as unacceptable levels of traffic congestion in Los Angeles. If we didn't do anything about it right away, the city would grind to a complete halt, within 2 or 3 years. And of course it didn't. And it sounds like a familiar refrain given what's happening in Los Angeles now. But the interesting thing is I presented my findings and I showed graphs and data and I used all sorts of arguments. And after a generous period of time of them listening to me and asking questions and whatever, the chair of the SCRTD board thanked me for my presentation. I was told that it was very, very valuable and that they would study it carefully. And after doing so, they were going to get back to me about, helping implement my ideas. Well, I heard nothing from them for 39 years. But in December of 2018, I was asked to address the Metro Board about transit fare policy and congestion pricing. So I went to the Metro Board and I opened my remarks by thanking them for having studied my earlier proposals and finally getting back to me. So the point is, many of the most pressing issues really aren't different than they were 30 and 40 years ago. And if you're patient and you learn from engaging with public policy, it may take a while and it may influence you and how you think about the subject matter. And your influence on public policy may well be indirect, but it can happen. And in the process, you may learn from it far more than you might think. Thank you very much.